Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to FreeThought Hour. Now, this is following the Global Atheist News, which some of you may have just come from watching. That's my other show, which goes out half an hour before this one. You'll be welcome to watch that in future. It's a weekly event, and it reports on the impact that religion has had on humanity over the previous 7 days. Global Atheist News, in case you've not caught it before. Meanwhile, I'd like you to subscribe and set the notifications and comment and share the link and do all the normal things that people who make YouTube videos ask you to do. And I'm very bad at reminding people to do that. Anyway, the main thrust of a FreeThought Hour is the guest. And I have a very interesting guest tonight. He's an old mucker, as you might say. We were both together for some years working for Atheist Alliance International before I moved on. But anyway, it's not about me. It's about Jason. Here he is, Jason Sylvester. How the devil are you, Jason?
I'm good, John. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, actually. I have finally, I think, recovered from COVID, which has been dragging on, but I'm counting it as done now. I'm
good.
particularly pleased to have you on, and I think you're a bit of a hero because what's the time where you are?
It's 2:30 in the morning.
Well, that's real dedication to duty, isn't it? Yeah. So well done for staying awake. So people like to hear the journey that my guests have undergone, and you started out in Canada. You're a Canadian, aren't you?
I am.
But you've journeyed, haven't you, around the world? And I don't know whether you were involved in a religion early on, or I know that you're now what you might consider to be an atheist. Is that, I don't know if that's the word you use about yourself, because it's a word with some baggage, isn't it? But
it is. Yeah.
I'm rabbiting, and it's really you. So tell us, how did you get to be the Jason Sylvester that you are today? And I'm going to full screen you so that you can tell our audience. Here we go.
Okay. So yeah, I started off was a Christian up through probably into my mid-20s. I would have considered myself a Christian. I went to church every Sunday. I went to a fairly moderate Protestant church, the United Church of Canada. I went to a Baptist school for 2 years where I got heavily indoctrinated, had the whole born again experience. But then once I got out of that school, I sort of graduated back to moderate Christianity. Then I went off to university, and I wasn't really going to church anymore. And of course, in university, you're exposed to all kinds of ideas. And I took a couple of history electives. I took a world religions class. And then by the time I came out of university, I would have considered myself a deist. I wouldn't say I was still a non-believer. And I would say up into my mid-30s, I probably would have considered myself a deist. And then I describe myself as sort of being on the continuum, having been a moderate and evangelical and back to moderate to deist. So I describe it as my journey as a continuum. And then I never had like that aha moment. I woke up one day and I just went, I just don't believe anymore. Just for whatever reason, I just stopped believing. And then about 2008 or 9, I was involved in an online forum. There was a discussion. We had some evangelical teachers who were pushing creationism in the classroom in my local community where I was living in at the time. And my answers were just getting longer and longer and longer. People were challenging me to like back up what I was saying. Like instead of like just some flippant, offhand comment, people were challenging me to back it up. And I think one of my answers ended up being like a 3,000 word essay. And I thought, hey, there's a book here. And so I started working on a book in summer of 2009, my first book, Manifest Insanity, which was a rebuttal against the Christian right in the US and their attempts to push creationism into the classroom. And it started during 2000. We were in the world global financial crisis. Of course, it's August in in Hong Kong where I was at the time, and a lot of people are on vacation. It's incredibly hot and humid, and so there was, it was like an August day, and I was just, there was just nothing going on, and so I started writing just to help keep my mind occupied until things picked up again, and it took me about 3 years to write it. The research I did, and again, so Manifest Insanity it's a polemic. It's directed against the U.S. Christian right, but it's also a history of how the Judeo-Christian doctrines evolved, because the evangelicals, they claim that the Bible is literally true, it's without error. And so as I was arguing these points, this point, the creation story, the Noah's Ark, where do these stories come from, and in some cases, how have certain things changed? So you can't say that the Bible is literally true and without error when there's plenty of contradictions in the Bible, even though they will try to rationalize them, sometimes rather comically. And so it ended up becoming where I just kind of started out going after evolution and creationism, the creationism in the classroom. It sort of evolved into this long history of how the Bible, Judeo-Christian doctrines have changed over the centuries.
Can I interrupt there? I'd like to track back a bit, because you mentioned what was going on in the classroom and how you were doing answers to, I guess, some of their claims, or responses to some of their claims. But where were you doing this? Were you in the classroom? Were you on the stage?
This was an online forum.
Right.
It's just like it was an expat thread, and it was just these debates going back and forth in the thread, and just the arguments for creationism were just so nonsensical, and I was just throwing out like these little trite one-liners, and people were saying, well, back up what you're saying, don't just don't just dismiss my belief, back it up.
Yes,
and
that's
so
right.
I said, so the one answer.
It's a reasonable request, isn't it? Because I do the same thing, especially on Facebook, and one of my favorite groups is it came out of the Premier Christian radio show. I've got a child in here. Go away!
Tammy's not in the.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm making a show. Don't. Never have children, Jason.
Yeah.
So, look at this one. So now I've completely forgotten what I was saying. It's Justin. I can't. My brain is completely gone. I blame you.
You were mentioning the Christian Premier or something. You were starting to say.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So there's a show on the radio which I've been on, and there's a Facebook group that's a spin-off, and lots of people. It's a Christian and atheist. It's open. When I say open, it's a closed group. Nobody can get in it if they've not been accepted to be a member. But the forum is a mixture of theists and non-theists, and a lot of the time the subject matter is evolution, and it's so tempting to say, well, this is rubbish, and want to get away with it, but that doesn't work. And you're right, what you have to get into then is a whole chapter of explanation, because the ramifications and complexities of evolution, and trying to get across a couple of what seemed like simple points into the minds of people who have been wrongly informed takes a lot of words.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time trying to explain things, because you can't just take for granted that somebody understands either the history or the context, or even say this specific verse, or the evolution, or any concept, whether it's evolutionary or whatever doctrine. That I had to spend quite a bit of time, in exposition, and try to explaining it to a reader who might not have a background in either biblical studies or. Because not everybody has either attended a Christian church or is familiar with Christian history, or so. Yeah, it there's a lot of explanation. I'm doing this sort of the same thing in the new book that I'm working on as well, which instead of a history of Christianity is a history of secularism. And I have to take a lot of time to explain certain things and go into what is the historical context behind this. I can't just say, in 502 this happened. There's a lot of backstory that goes along with it that needs to be put in it. And there's context is so important, that so many things require the context and the historical background to really make sense of it.
The meanings of words too, they have entirely different meanings to us for some of the words that we want to use. It was the Justin Brierley radio show called Unbelievable, that with a question mark, which I was referring to. And you would like this Facebook group, which is a spin-off, Unbelievable. There's all sorts of theists to educate in there.
Yeah. Well, anyway. Some of them are willing to be, and when I was writing Manifest Insanity, I actually say in the introduction that, I know I'm not going to. Thank you. I know I'm not going to change the mind of anybody who's a devout Christian, and that's not my intent. But there might be a handful of moderate Christians or those who are sitting on the fences who I might just shove over to the other side. And I have had a couple people have reached out to me and said, you helped give me sort of the historical background to understand my decision and why I don't believe. And I was able to convert of the one woman I know that I've converted. I was just at a beach picnic and I was chatting with this woman and she had been telling me that she had been to a number of different churches. Like, I think she grew up Roman Catholic and she'd been to some evangelical churches and she'd been to the Mormon church, and she couldn't find the answers to the questions that she was looking for. And I just looked at her and I said, that's because simply you're asking the wrong question. You're coming at all of these religions based on the premise that they have the right answer. But if you just go back to first principles and just assume that there is no God and everything they're saying is wrong, and that they're building off a faulty premise to begin with, and then that was just like the light bulb going off in her head, and it just suddenly all made sense, and it crystallized. And then I ran into her a few months later, and she goes, "Yeah, I'm an atheist now." And I said, "What happened?" And went, "You talked to me."
Well, sometimes it does work like that, and that is the principle behind the Aristotelian, the Sophocles, which one of those Greek guys.
Like the Socratic method?
That's the one, the Socratic method, isn't it? That's the whole principle. Talk to people, don't argue with them, just ask reasonable questions and get them to try and justify their beliefs. And somehow or other, instead of confronting you, they begin to think. And so, see, I maintain that you can't ban religion. I don't know what you feel about this, but I think that would be ridiculous to try and do that. What you can do is lead people to work out for themselves that it's doesn't really make sense. That's what you can do.
Yeah. Well, there's that great line from House with the British actor Hugh Laurie saying, reason doesn't work on religious people, otherwise there would be no religious people. Or rationality. I can't remember if it was reason or rationality, one of those R words. But
yes.
And there's another quote that you can't reason somebody out of a premise that they didn't reason themselves into.
Yeah. I don't know who said that either. Probably Hitchens or Sam, one of those guys. Yeah. So you've got a particular antipathy towards the Roman Catholic religion, I believe, even though you've been talking about discussing creationism and
evangelicals
with the evangelicals.
Yeah.
So how did you acquire this dislike of Roman Catholic?
It's not, I don't dislike necessarily the religion or the people. I mean, I have sympathy for the people. I don't understand the people who, and I've said this publicly before, the Roman Catholics who are still supporting the church, given the ongoing sexual abuse scandals.
Yeah.
To me, you are complicit. You keep sending money to them every month. You're complicit in this. How you can justify staying with this institution that has shown itself to be criminal. So it's the institution that I dislike, and it came to me through the research that I've done on Manifest Insanity, the first book on the history of Judeo-Christianity, and my new book that I'm working on, which is the history of secularism. I've spent all year writing a single chapter on the Vatican. So each chapter is nominally an era. So chapter 1 is classical antiquity, where I go into the ancient Greeks and Romans who were free thinkers, the handful that probably were atheists. I mean, there were obviously atheists in antiquity. There were certainly free thinking, someone like Epicurus, who believed in the gods. Democritus believed in the gods. They just thought these were entities that were not interested in they were not involved in humanity. They weren't a personal god. And then chapter 3 will be the Renaissance, and then chapter 4 will be the Reformation, and so on. So I've been working on chapter 2 all year to bridge classical antiquity and the Renaissance. But I go beyond the Renaissance, because chapter 2 is on the history of the Vatican and what happened between classical antiquity and the Renaissance, with not only the suppression of philosophy and intellectual pursuits, but the political power that the Vatican managed to accrue to itself. And so I've actually gone beyond the Renaissance. I'm just finally up to 1929, when Mussolini granted the Vatican statehood through the Lateran Accords in return for them supporting fascism. And so it's been a very, like I said, I've spent all year just on this single chapter, and this single chapter is now well over 100 pages, 400 footnotes, and I'm thinking this is probably a book all on its own. And then what I can do is then, in the main book on the history of secularism, is I can condense all that information down into maybe 20, 30 page, just very, very high level summary up to the Renaissance. And then I can say, see the other book for all the details. And as I've researched that book, there have been, I'm just absolutely gobsmacked at the lies that they've told over and over again. That there's a fantastic book I came across. A German scholar recommended it to me, and so I've gone off on a few tangents, coming across some research that I'll want to go, and I want to dig into something a little deeper. And I came across this one bit something that happened in 502. And so I started digging into it, but I couldn't find any. There was very, very little information on it in English. And I spent like a month just Google searching, looking for clues. And I came across this German scholar, and he recommended a book by Professor George Demokopoulos, who is a professor at Fordham University in New York City, which is a Catholic university. But Demokopoulos, he's in the Orthodox branch of the school. And he wrote an amazing book. It's almost 10 years old now. Absolutely fantastic book called The Invention of Peter. And it was just so chock full of just incredibly fascinating details about how the Vatican invented the whole idea that the primacy of Peter, and that Peter was the passage in Matthew, which scholars believe is fraudulent, but we can talk about that later. I don't want to get off topic. But that the whole basis that the Catholic Church, or that the Vatican and the Bishop of Rome particularly had supremacy, comes out of nothing but papal rhetoric, that they just declared themselves to be the leading see, and it's just been perpetuated over and over and over again. And I talk about this in the book. I chart all of these different evolutions in the advancement of these lies. And there's I looked it up, that psychologists call it the illusory truth effect. That if you tell a lie long enough, it just takes on the persona of truth. And so starting in the 490s. So even before that, they're starting to accrue some power. But in the 490s, Pope Gelasius wrote a letter to the Eastern Roman Emperor. And now 490, this is, within a generation of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, And so there's only the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire left. And so Pope Gelasius, around somewhere between 492, 495, I can't remember exactly when it came, wrote a letter to the Eastern Roman Emperor and declared that the spiritual realm is superior to the secular, and therefore the emperor is subservient to the Pope. And this is it's known as the doctrine of two powers. And you can look at it. You can go on Wikipedia. The article on Wikipedia is actually listed under its Latin name, which I can't remember. But if you type into the search bar "duo sunt," DUO space SUNT, it'll take you to this article. And that sort of becomes the basis from there on. And then I mentioned in 502, another lie that sort of led me off on this excursion, builds on the Gelasian two powers doctrine, that states that because what was going on at 502 is the Pope, what's his name? Pope Symmachus was on trial for a number of things, whether the charges were true or not. And so they invented duo sunt, not SUNT, SUNT.
Oh, okay.
Pope Symmachus was on trial. And so they created this fictional council that nominally took place in 324. And this is what led me off on this three months of research of this really obscure stuff, was trying to find out, okay, when did this supposed council take place? What are the details around it? And so out of this fictional council that nominally took place in 324, 1 year before the Council of Nicaea, nominally stated that no pope could be held accountable, that a pope could only be judged by God, and that only, a bishop could only be charged with 72 people. And so this then lays the foundation, and that actually is encoded in the canon law today, that the Pope can only be tried by God. It's canon law 1404.
Yes.
And so
they don't accept human jurisdiction.
No, and so that's sort of the basis of this whole child sexual abuse thing. That why do we not have to report it to secular authorities? You just report it to your bishop, who will report it up the ladder. It all comes back to the 490s and this declaration that spiritual power is higher than secular, and it's all based on this fictional declaration. They just declared it, and then of course, and then Democopolis, he goes on, and then from there you have other declarations, and it just proceeds from there. And he makes a very, very interesting point, that all of these proclamations, all of these rhetorical declarations are all based in weakness. That all of these, that we are the Pope, we have primacy through Peter. They're all founded at a period of weakness where the Pope himself has he's not even being listened to by his own bishops in Italy. He's being thoroughly ignored by the Eastern bishops altogether. Yes. And so these are all papal pretensions and rhetoric, and it just builds generation after generation until later generations of Catholics and the laity, have just forgotten that it's all based on rhetoric and a lie. Again, the illusory truth effect. It just takes on this persona of truth. And so the whole premise that the Catholic Church has primacy is based on lies and myths and half-truths. Even the whole story that Peter was in Rome, and Democopolis does a good job of outlining where this story comes from, and it shows up in the 2nd century. I can't remember which author it shows up in. I want to say Tertullian, but I'm probably wrong on that. I'm pretty sure I'm wrong on that. That the story that Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and any Christian scholar outside of the evangelical biblical schools will tell you Peter was not the first pope. There were no popes in Rome, or there was no organized church with a bishop in Rome until well into the 2nd century. So they know there could be that Peter couldn't have been the same pope. Couldn't have been the first bishop of Rome or the first pope. And ironically, that what is Rome associated with? Rome was associated with Paul. That's where Paul was imprisoned and executed. And so Democopoulos does a really good job of talking about how the story of Peter, that Peter is in Rome, how it comes about, and then how it starts building from there. So it comes out of this sort of secondary literature that's based on a myth, and the myth grows into a declaration, and the declaration more myths and more lies, and so papal power just builds and builds and builds, and then beyond the myths and the lies and the half truths, you have their abuse of power and the shameful history, and the Vatican knows that Peter was the first pope. They know that all of this stuff, it's just existentially frustrating to know the history and to know that the Vatican knows what they're doing.
It's not in their interest to reveal that they know, of course, because thereby goes their power and their income and everything. Yeah. So what's the title of this second book?
My working title is Dangerous Ideas. And that comes about because it's only in the modern era where we can say these things without fear of death. I know one of the famous quotes by A.C. Grayling, I will paraphrase it, is that, when we used to say something, you burned us at the stake. Now we're just putting some challenging arguments to us and you're complaining.
Yes. It's one-sided, isn't it?
Yeah. And so I had this thought. I was reading Dermot McCulloch. Forgive me if I pronounced your name wrong. He's a professor at Oxford who wrote a book called The First 3,000 Years. It's a history of Christianity by Dermot McCulloch, who's professor of the history of the church at Oxford. And it's like well over 1,000 pages. Very, very detailed. It's just an incredible read. If you're interested in the history of Christianity, it's a phenomenal book. He actually did a BBC documentary in 2009, a 6-part documentary that's broken up into early Christianity, the Catholics, the Orthodox, Protestantism, and it's just a phenomenally well done series.
I wonder if that's still available somewhere.
It is. You can find it on Dailymotion. So I would highly recommend people to watch it. It's an incredible series. It's so well done. And as I got towards the end of his book, and he was starting to talk about how atheism is being challenged, I thought, hey, no one's ever, to my knowledge, argument from ignorance, no one has ever done a book on the history of atheism in the style that McCulloch did, for Christianity. And I thought, how did we go from 400 years ago, Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake, along with Jan Hus and others who were brutally killed, to somebody, the Four Horsemen, Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Harris, and of course all of the other people who have achieved global celebrity. And so in 400 years, how do we go from killing people from speaking out to you can be an international celebrity for non-belief and secular? So because so many of these ideas that these philosophers were putting forth were so dangerous and so threatening that some of them were put to death, that I call the book Dangerous Ideas, and it's charting the evolution of secularism. So as I said, I start with classical antiquity, and I go through the arguments that the handful of atheists who have survived. Obviously, there were probably more in antiquity, but because of the nature of papyrus, and the Catholic Church certainly didn't preserve a lot of literature that was contrary. So we do have a smattering of atheist writings, or at least free thinking and people who were questioning that whether the gods were corporeal, incorporeal, involved, not involved, such Democritus,
Yes.
Epicurus, etc.
Yes.
They have chapter 2 that I've been working on all year on, okay, then what happens? So the Catholic Church comes in, philosophy, because Paul says philosophy, you know, the wisdom of the wise, and yada yada, all those quotes in the Bible where he's dismissive of philosophy. And there's multiple quotes from early Christian thinkers, like especially Augustine and others, who are very dismissive of secular, you know, clear your minds of secular knowledge and receive the word of the Lord, sort of thing. And so how from the very beginning of Christianity, there is this opposition to not only philosophy in itself, but to learning in general. And then it moves into the political power and how they started accruing political power. So you get Pope Leo in the 400s, when Rome is already starting to fall. Even before the Western Roman Empire collapses, the Bishop of Rome is already starting to take on some civic duties. So Leo, when I think it was the Vandals and what's his name, Attila, it was the Pope. It was Leo who went out and negotiated with Attila and got Attila to turn back, and also negotiated with the Vandals. And so by the time that Rome falls, and then you get Gregory the Great, so the popes are already starting to take on more and more civic responsibilities as the Senate is failing, and then so by the 500s or so, you've basically got the administration of the church in Rome has basically taken over running the city, and then their power just grows from there.
So instead of what Constantine wanted, he wanted to make the church a state religion, make the Christian church, wasn't called the Roman Catholic Church at that time, make the Christian church a state religion. And he paid some of the bishops, and he set up the Council of Nicaea, so on and so forth, in an attempt to bolster up what was his failing empire. It was splitting apart. But instead of that being the result, the takeover was the other way round. And the church ended up in the boss role.
Right. Well, he didn't make it a state religion. In 313, he signed the Edict of Milan, which was just toleration, and the Roman Empire was famously tolerant of the religions throughout the empire. But it wasn't until Theodosius in the 380s that it became officially the state religion.
But he wanted to be subordinate to the emperor.
Right. But what he did see, and I've seen quite a few scholars mention this, that because he's fought for 10 to 12 years to reunite, because Diocletian had fractured the empire, not fractured, had split the empire into four, the Tetrarchy, to manage it more easily. And so he had then fought the civil war to bring it all back together. And so one of the theories is that he sees the sort of the centralized church bureaucracy. You've got bishops and stuff like that, and you've got them, and he could see it as a not necessarily a unifying factor, but that he could the administration of the church bureaucracy, which was modeled on the Roman imperial system, could be used as a way to help him to reunite and run the empire. So that was an aspect of it, and sort of this, as I mentioned earlier, this council in 324. So at the time that at the time that Constantine was emperor, and calls the Council of Nicaea in 322, the Pope at the time was Pope Sylvester, who my family is named after, and this is great source of embarrassment to me now. So this fake council that I said in 502, where the Pope is on trial, was called the Constitutum Sylvestri, where they said the Pope can't be tried. Now the ironic thing is all of this mythological, it all starts being developed shortly after Constantine dies, because Sylvester was so uninvolved. He wasn't involved in the council. I want to say the Council of Arles in around 314. He wasn't there. Constantine was. Sylvester didn't show up at the at the Council of Nicaea. And so all of these legends, so those people who know of the donation of Constantine and stuff, all of this mythology starts building up around Pope Sylvester, that he himself had baptized Constantine when it's well documented that Constantine was baptized on his deathbed by an Arian bishop who were the losing side at Nicaea, not the Orthodox Christians. And so all of this, because of all these embarrassing facts, all of this mythology grows up around Sylvester. And so sometime around between 900 and 1100, so Sylvester's, apparently in the Anglo-Norman community, Sylvester becomes a family name as they've adopted it because of all of this mythology surrounding this great pope who was really quite ineffectual. So there's just so many lies in Catholic history.
Wasn't it Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda guy, who said that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes a truth?
Exactly. It's also attributed to Lenin as well.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Lots of these quotes.
And I think they probably took a quote from the Vatican.
Just as likely, yes.
Like even the word propaganda comes from the Catholic Church, because the Congregation for the Propagation of the Doctrine of the Faith, propaganda comes from the Catholic Church.
So. Well, there's an indictment in a word. So are you going to use illusory truth as a title of a chapter or something? Because that's a good pair.
It's just in the footnote. It's funny because you met the same quote you just attributed to Goebbels, and I said it was also Lemon, is in the same footnote where I talked about the illusory truth effect. And I said Goebbels and Lenin say this, and they were probably looking to the Vatican for inspiration. I think Donald Trump has probably taken a huge lesson from that. You just keep telling the lie, and your base will believe it, and start perpetuating it.
And not only Trump, but Boris as well. There's a big campaign going on because the local news doesn't report accurately the lies that are being spoken by our Prime Minister. I could link you to this. There's a Facebook, or is it Twitter campaign, which puts together clips of Boris saying one thing and then Boris saying the other thing, demonstrating the lies. And I think that's had 36 million views so far. So it's not something that's stopped.
Yeah. Well, politicians lie. So
yes. Although was it Churchill called it a terminological inexactitude? It's
a nice way of saying it.
Yeah, trying to make it sound okay. So last week I was at the Secular Education Forum here in London. Well, I'm not in London, but I went to London to attend that. And I discovered, believe it or not, that in the UK, there are 15 faith universities, and they're largely paid for by the state.
And these are private schools?
No. The story goes that they started out as teacher training colleges or priest training colleges, at which point they were funded by the diocese in which they were based. But when there was a change to the way universities were ratified, and a lot of training colleges, including teacher training colleges, and to my amazement, these priest training colleges, theological colleges, were uprated into universities. And at this point, of course, students can apply and will get not a grant, but a loan to fund them to study. They have to pay it back later on in life if they achieve a certain level of income. But the point is that loan is coming out of the public purse. So people like me are paying to have vicars and priests and whomsoever, clergy, trained.
Yeah, that seems a little unfair.
Very. It's outrageous. So we're campaigning against that.
Well, that's good. At least people are aware of it and can do something. Like if it's a private university, most people wouldn't have a problem. Say, hey, it's a private university, you can do whatever you want. But if you're on the public dime, sorry.
There are some private universities, and of course we don't control them. But when we're paying, we expect to have some say in what's going on.
Right. Yeah, that's a bit shocking. You wouldn't think there would be that many.
Well, no, it was a surprise to me. So let's go back to your story. How did you come? You've now been to the Far East, and you're now, I believe, in Thailand. How did this all come about?
Well, I was working in the U.S. I think all told, I've worked in 9 countries, worked and lived, not just, I've been in other places. Like I came to the UK in 2007 for a week on a project, but I wouldn't count that. I've worked in 9 different countries. So when I was working in the US for a telecom company, and then the tech bubble imploded in late 2001, and they laid off, tens of thousands of people. And a friend of mine had been teaching English in Asia. He said, "Hey, why don't you come out here?" And there were no decent paying jobs at the time because of the implosion. So I thought, well, came out to Asia for a year, and I taught English here, and then I went off to Australia and became a diving instructor, and then went and did that for a few months, and then went to Hong Kong, got back into the rat race. And it was really funny because I had at least 2 or 3 interviews. People said, "But you haven't worked in an office for a couple of years. You went off and taught English, then living on a beach in a tropical island teaching scuba." And I went, "What, do you think I've forgotten everything?" And then finally the guy who did hire me looked at my resume and saw that, hey, this guy just went off and did something completely different and lived on a beach and taught scuba diving, and I want to meet this guy.
Yes.
And then there's people who are aware. One, Hong Kong is an extremely expensive city to live in. I had a small studio flat, 250 square foot studio. I was paying, by the time I left, $2,000 a month. Plus, China has been, as we've seen in this last year, China has become increasingly authoritarian, and we now have seen what's happened with the new draconian laws in Hong Kong. So at the time, I could tell Hong Kong is getting unlivable, cost-wise, freedom-wise. And so I started taking more regional contracts, and I was picking up contracts in Philippines, and picked up a contract in China, and a contract. I was actually in Pakistan. I spent almost a year working in Pakistan, which for an atheist was interesting. The food was amazing. I loved the food in Pakistan. It was so good. Interestingly enough, working in Pakistan is when freedom really, really crystallized for me. So I'd been with Michael Sherlock, who is a former executive director of AAI, and he's the one who brought me into AAI, Atheist Alliance International, where I'm board member, blog manager, podcast host. Michael and I were both speaking in 2016 in Taipei at what is now Humanist International. At the time, they were still IHEU. I was speaking. We were both speaking at their Asian conference, and I met a Pakistani secularist who had come to Taiwan to the conference. And, we added each other on Facebook. And then I was sent to Pakistan on this project. And I went, "Hey, I'm in this town. I don't know where you live. Do you happen to live here too?" He goes, "Oh, I'm not far." And so he came for dinner. And we're sitting in a restaurant. And this was less than a year. So those people who probably may have remembered, there was a university student, I believe it might have been Lahore or somewhere in Punjab region, was dragged out of his dorm room at the university and beaten to death because someone had said he had blasphemed or whatever. It wasn't even true from what I know. They beat him to death. And this had it happened only within the previous few months. And we're sitting in a public restaurant and we're talking about atheism and secularism, and we're talking in very hushed tones.
Yes.
And that's when it just crystallized for me that just having this conversation, I can be arrested and tried for blasphemy. I can be dragged into the street and beaten and killed. And all of these evangelicals in the US who were whining about, "Oh, we're persecuted. We can't say Merry Christmas." I'm like, pardon my French, shut the fuck up. You have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to freedom. That, you know, just me having that conversation could get me killed was just a huge eye opener. Now I did meet some atheists there. I was, you know, working with a lot of, not necessarily, so I wasn't working with, but I was socializing with a lot of people who've got master's degrees, who've worked, have worked abroad, and socializing with these people. And I'm a very open and forthright person. And so I would talk to them, you know, and a few of them would admit to me that they didn't believe. So, I mean, they're there, you know, they just can't say it, you know, publicly.
Yeah, they're in the closet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you keep in touch with that fellow you had dinner with?
Occasionally, yeah. He's now Michael was quite instrumental. He went to New Zealand and he got asylum, and Michael was actually instrumental in helping him with the lawyers and getting, because his initial application to the New Zealand government for asylum was denied. Apparently, as I recall, the immigration officer looking at his case was a Muslim woman who said, "Oh yeah, you're," you know, and they denied it. And then Michael got involved, brought in some lawyers, and got the case reviewed, and he was granted status in New Zealand.
Good, that's one success then. Yeah. And if you saw my show last week, I had Nuria Khan was my guest, and she is somebody else who's escaped from Islam, which is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. Well, I've seen quite a few articles in the last few months about the growing spread of non-believers in Islam, and I you know, they're there. They're just because they live in such authoritarian countries, they have to be very, very careful about it. So
yes, which is terrible. Yes, that shouldn't be allowed. So, what would you do? I mean, if I gave you an opportunity to enforce your wishes, what would you want to ban religion, or would you?
Oh no, that would be ridiculous. I think, and I would think most people would agree that most secular humanists, if we to debaggage the atheist label, I don't think you'll find any secular humanist that would be advocating for the banning of religion altogether. I mean, that just smacks of authoritarianism all on its own.
Yes. And it's likely to produce the worst reaction.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Now, there might be a small percentage of those who do, but I would say that the majority of secular humanists are probably saying, you know, all we're asking for is freedom. Freedom for everybody, freedom for you to believe what you want to believe, and freedom for us not to believe. And you do your thing and we'll do ours. And, you know, as I said, with what got me involved in my first book was the attempted injection of evangelical Christians to push their beliefs onto American society with evolution, creationism in the classroom, banning evolution in Kansas, which they did twice. I was actually living in Kansas City the first time the State Board of Education banned evolution. Incidentally, for the people who don't know, the flying spaghetti monster came out of the banning of evolution by the State Board of Education of Kansas. He says, "Hey, teach the controversy." So he invented it. I said, "Well, what up there is this flying spaghetti monster? Why aren't you teaching that?"
Here's a controversy for you.
Right. So, and it's not just evolution. It's, you know, they're denying, they don't want gay marriage. You know, a lot of them are against women's rights. You know, they essentially want to roll back the clock to the Middle Ages. You know, they'd be quite happy. And I would think most secular humanists are just saying, do your thing. So I have no intention of banning religion. That I think that would just be completely counterproductive. So.
Yeah. In fact, you mentioned humanism, and we've talked a lot about history. And humanism seems to have started pretty much in the Renaissance. There were some early humanists.
It did, but most of those humanists were Christians. But a lot of them were quite intrigued with classical antiquity. And that's, from what I understand, I haven't started writing my Renaissance chapter yet, but I have quite a few notes. That it was, I think the first humanist was Plutarch, or he's considered the first humanist. And Plutarch rediscovered a lost work of Cicero. And then one of the papal secretaries for one of the worst popes in history rediscovered On the Nature of Things by Lucretius, which basically just lit a fire on the Renaissance. And it's On the Nature of Things that inspired Galileo and Da Vinci and Spinoza and Machiavelli and the French Revolution and the American Revolutionary Fathers. It just had a huge impact. So
rippled up to the Enlightenment, even in Scotland.
Yeah. And so the humanists were Christians, but they were free-thinking Christians who saw the benefits of the philosophy of classical antiquity. And then obviously humanism has evolved, like everything, every religion. Like not only does Christianity evolve, every religion evolves.
Yes.
And humanism has evolved, where it's become pretty much equivalent of non-belief, that, I have no beliefs, but just the belief in, humans are decent human beings and have the right to live a life of self-actualization and fulfillment without persecution.
Human rights, humanitarian treatment, that sort of thing. Yeah. I always think that, because I belong to the Humanists UK as well, and I always think that humanism is a bit like, in fact, I'm going to speak to the Humanists in Manchester in the middle of next week, but I always think that it's a bit like, it's a safer way of describing yourself as a non-believer than atheism is. It's a bit of a cop-out because...
Well, there's so much baggage, as you said, there's so much baggage associated with that label of atheist, because especially in the US, where repeated surveys have shown that people distrust atheists. They think they're immoral and Satanists and baby killers, and it's just ridiculous.
Distrust them more than politicians and estate agents. Yes.
And Muslims. They trust atheists less than Muslims,
Yes, there's so much propaganda that's been put out about the word atheism. So it's understandable that some people don't want to sign up to it and prefer the sort of lighter touch, atheism light that humanism seems to be in some societies. Yeah.
If I could just quickly mention, as the only Canadian on the board of AAI, I was asked if I would join a committee. In Canada, there's a committee of multiple humanist groups. And I believe it goes Monday. So we finished up. So I started this with you at 2:30, but last night I was on a call at 3 a.m. To 4:30 a.m. with this working group. And we have drafted a letter to the Canadian Immigration Minister. It's signed by all of our groups and other groups. I asked Stephen Pinker to sign it. I asked Lawrence Krauss to sign it, as they're both prominent Canadians. And because the Canadian government has a special visa program for Afghani refugees, and one of the conditions that you can apply under is, are you a member of a persecuted religious minority? But there is no mention of non-belief. And as we all know, non-belief or apostasy in Islam is punishable by death. So this group of Canadian atheists, of which I am the signatory on behalf of AAI, is going to the immigration minister in Canada on Monday to say, we please change your policy to include non-belief, that, the non-believers in Afghanistan are under threat of death.
Yes, indeed.
So please grant, the special visas to non-believers, not just members of persecuted religious minorities. Like, why should a religious minority get preferential treatment? And you're not acknowledging. So we feel this is an oversight that deserves a humanist correction.
Absolutely. Yes. More power to your elbow there. Yes, we need non-belief to have the same rights as any other sect, denomination. I don't want to call it a religion, because it isn't.
No.
So I wanted to say, we're coming to the end of our time now, unfortunately, but I wanted to say that next week I have an interesting guest too. His name is James Fraycroft. He was educated at the University of Cambridge, partly, but now he's resident in St. Louis, the USA, and he's the leader of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, and he's He styles himself as a radical queer theologian. So I should be interested to find out what he means by that next week. Anyway, so you don't want to ban religion. I think it's very, very sensible. What do you want to do? Because my thing is I want to help people find out enough about natural reality.
Yeah.
Natural realm, so that they give up on it themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think Richard Dawkins has a fantastic quote about how the creation story is just so boring and sort of, I think parochial was the word he used, when you look at the actual science behind the Big Bang and astrophysics and nucleosynthesis and how we're all made of stardust. It's a much, much, much better story than, oh God, just flicked a switch in 6 days.
It's even more fantastical, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you want
again, the nature there is obviously good. But what I would like to see, I've made the point repeatedly to Christians or theists in general that if your religion is so important to you, why don't you know anything about it? Why do I know more of the history of the doctrines and the evolution of your religion than you do? In any religion, in Buddhism, in Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Christian. I mean, I've been studying this for over 10 years now.
Yeah, I bet I know what they say back at you. They say,
well,
it's obviously your religion then, because you're devoting yourself to studying it.
I remember one guy said, I know my religion. I said, you probably have a surface grasp of probably less than 1% of your religion. You can probably spout 5 to 10 Bible verses and maybe some of the major doctrines, but beyond that, you have no idea where these passages came from, how they've changed, how they've evolved. And so I discovered the word in 2020. I'd never heard it before, by another atheist blogger called Intellectual Atheism. And I thought, I kind of fit into that because I like the history. I like the context of where all of this stuff came from and how it's changed over time. So, and I just make the point, what I would like is that people would be educated. And like I said, I've made the point repeatedly, if your religion is so important to you, why don't you know any of this stuff? I mean, surely if you're basing all of your life decisions on, well, my religion says this, maybe you should thoroughly understand it, but then thoroughly understanding it is going to lead to atheism. So
absolutely. So I've got another question for you here on a top of the pops or top of the popes. Who do you think is the worst pope? Do you think Leo has a chance of being number one?
Pope Leo from the 400s? No, he was apparently a fairly able administrator.
Okay. So who's your worst pope?
Well, I think I wouldn't say worst, but I think John Paul II has quite a bit to answer for. That he's, we had Vatican II in the late 60s, and John Paul is widely regarded by Catholic scholars as being somewhat reactionary and traditionalist and trying to drag it back a little bit. He is also seriously responsible for the global sex scandal. He protected, he protected or the people in his entourage surrounding him sheltered him from people like Maciel in Mexico and what was going on. So I think John Paul II has quite a bit to answer. Whether he's the worst in history, probably not. Gosh, there's so many examples. Probably one of those bastards who shoved the Jews into the ghettos in Rome in the 1500s during the Counter-Reformation. They certainly have some splaining to do.
It's a hotly contested role, isn't it? Worst pope.
It's funny. I think Pope Boniface VIII. He's widely regarded as pretty bad. I found it just incredibly funny that in Dante's Inferno, Boniface is in hell. Yet one of the scholastic philosophers, I can't remember his name now. I'm completely blanking on the name of the scholastic philosopher. is in paradise, but the Pope is in hell. I thought that was really, really funny.
Mhm.
Oh,
Well, and another term that I stumbled across recently, I hadn't heard of it before, is ig-theism. Have you heard of that?
it sounds familiar. I couldn't define it, but I may have stumbled across it once or twice.
Well, apparently what it means is we don't know what a god might be like. There's no consensus of agreement over the qualities, the characteristics, the properties of a god. Everybody has their own view of what a god, creator, deity might be like, and they're all different. So given that we don't know what a god might be like, we can't even begin to investigate the veracity of the claim that there is one or not.
Yeah, well, that probably has its roots. That would have its from how you described it. I would say that sort of has its roots in negative theology that says you can't define what God is. All we can really do is say what God isn't, to try to rationalize a lot of stuff. So
that doesn't give us much of a chance of proving that he's real, since we don't know what we're looking for.
No.
On that note, you have been as academic and intellectual as I prophesied that you would be. So that makes me a very good prophet. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming on. And
thank you for having me on, and your kind words about me. I appreciate that. It's nice to be thought of that way, especially after the effort that I've put into researching and writing, and it's been fun. Like the writing, the things that I've learned have been so much fun to learn. So
it's your mission, isn't it? Keep at it. You're doing a grand job.
Oh, thank you.
So there you go. Thank you very much. And thank you, viewers, for watching. And thank you, future viewers who will see this as a podcast. And don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, notify, all that stuff. And come back next week to see James Frey Croft, leader of the Ethical Society of St. Louis. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Put your outro up, Jaden. Here we go.